You're muted. What did you say?
Started. Good afternoon. I'm Candace Black, Director of the Good Thunder Reading Series. Welcome to the Craft Talk portion of an MSU Creative Writing Residency featuring fiction writer Chris McCormick and poet Michael Torres. We are meeting virtually today because of safe spacing concerns still during the coronavirus pandemic. So thank you for making the extra effort to join us. We do have another event later today, the reading at 7:30 tonight, and you can enter the Zoom meeting the exact same way that you entered this. So that's, I think that's that news. Before we begin, I need to thank several parts of Minnesota State University Mankato for their support, the Department of English, the College of Arts and Humanities, and the Office of Diversity and Inclusion. And I'd like to take a few minutes now to honor Lawrence Ferlinghetti, who died earlier this week after a long life of being a great literary citizen, a champion of all the arts, founder of City Lights Booksellers and Publishers in San Francisco, which published Allen Ginsberg's Howl. He did a lot of great work for poetry. Here's an excerpt from one of his poems. Poetry as insurgent art. I am signaling you through the flames. The North Pole is not where it used to be. Manifest destiny is no longer manifest. Civilization self-destructs. Nemesis is knocking at the door. What are poets for in such an age? What is the use of poetry? The state of the world calls out for poetry to save it. If you would be a poet, create works capable of answering the challenge of apocalyptic times, even if this meaning sounds apocalyptic. You are Whitman, you are Poe, you are Mark Twain, you are Emily Dickinson and Edna St. Vincent Millay, you are Neruda and Mayakovsky and Pasolini. You are an American or a non-American. You can conquer the conquerors with words. Those of you who are familiar with Craft Talks, our Craft Talk, will know that it lasts about 30 minutes or so, followed by about 20 minutes or so of Q&A. Our guests are muted just to keep the background noise levels down, but you can use the chat function to ask a question. And then once we're in the Q&A, it might not be too chaotic if you unmute to ask a question. Chris McCormick is the author of the novel The Gimmicks, now available in paperback, and of the short story collection Desert Boys. His stories and essays have appeared in The Atlantic, the Los Angeles Times, Tin House, and Plowshares. Michael Torres' book of poems, An Incomplete List of Names, was selected by Raquel Salas Rivera for the National Poetry Series. It was recently named one of National Public Radio's best books of 2020. Both teach in the creative writing program here at MSU Mankato. And I believe that Chris McCormick is speaking first.
Thanks, Candace. And thank you everybody for being here. It really means a lot to me. It was a good group. I want to make it very clear right at the start that Michael saw my sweater earlier today and then changed into his sweater. So if you notice a similarity, it's his fault, not mine. Thank you, Emily, too, for your help orchestrating this. I thought it would be fun today to look at beginnings of stories. So I'm going to talk about beginnings of stories. I think Michael's going to talk in some way about beginnings of poems. And so in that way, it'll feel more cohesive than not. I thought I'd start with sharing a document that I'm putting together. Let me do that. Everyone sees this? Cool. What a clever title, you might say. I'm thinking about the ending of beginnings is really what I'm trying to look at today. And I'm going to start with a really simple exercise that I've shared with some of my students. So if you're out there in the audience and you've done this exercise before, it'll be good review. And if you haven't, you'll get caught up. And then I'm going to try to delve a little bit deeper than I have in the past. So hopefully we'll have a fun time thinking about this. And I'm going to try to keep this really brief so that Michael has his full time, and then we'll have a lot of time for questions. So my theory that I've been working at is that sentences have the same structure as jokes. That's not to say that sentences have to be funny, but that a sentence has a punchline. Every sentence has a punchline. And I want to think about how we can revise our sentences to land as forcefully as possible on the punchline of the sentence. Whatever your effect is that you're going for, if you're trying to break someone's heart, or if you're trying to make somebody laugh, whatever the effect is, there's a way you can shape your sentence to land as forcefully as possible. So just to start off, I thought we'd look at this example that I like to look at with my students. This is actually a sentence that a student of mine wrote in a story. And I use it because it's a really good sentence already, I think. It has a lot going for it already. But there's one way we can tweak it maybe to land on its emotional punchline. So the sentence is, at the end of the night, he drove me to a lookout where we kissed as the rain started to fall. When I ask my students to read that sentence again really slowly and to think about how a joke, if you tell a joke and you kind of tell the punchline halfway through the joke and then continue setting up the punchline after you've told the punchline, you're not going to get as much of a laugh as you could have otherwise. So where's the punchline of this sentence? I ask my students. And at the end of the night, he drove me to a lookout where we kissed as the rain started to fall. Usually when I teach this, there's a pretty wide range of answers, but generally we agree that that kiss is where the punchline of this sentence is. And if you're like me, I'm like, I don't give a damn what happens after the kiss in the sentence. I'm still thinking about that kiss. At the end of the night, he drove me to a lookout where we kissed as the rain started to fall. The rain starting to fall is like in the background in my mind. I'm still focusing on that kiss. So just as an example just to tweak this a little bit, if we agree, and you'll have to make these decisions artistically in your own stories, but if we agree that this is the punchline of this sentence, how can we land there? My suggestion, just as one possible answer, is this. And at the end of the night, he drove me to a lookout where, as the rain started to fall, we kissed. Now you can feel that kiss as forcefully as you might want the reader to feel it. And there's this really lovely fall, comma, we kissed, almost leading us as we're falling in love maybe too, as these people might be too, into this moment. So this is one of the most exciting for me parts of the revision process. I go back and look at my stories and I think, how can I maximize the effect of every single sentence to land on the punchline of every single sentence? Not only is this sentence working much better, but in my opinion, but it's also doing this thing where it's creating momentum. I cannot wait to see the baton get passed to the next sentence now. Now I'm thinking, okay, where are we going next? So there's a little bit of energy amplified here too, just by rearranging the sentence really subtly like this. So this is the thing that I've done with students a lot. So maybe you've already seen this part of it. But I got to thinking as I was preparing for this talk, if it's true for sentences that there's a punchline and that we can reshape a sentence to maximize the force of a sentence, might it also be true in units of language that are larger than a sentence? Might it also be true for paragraphs. Can a paragraph do this work? Can a scene land as forcefully as possible? And extrapolating further, can a whole story work the same way? Can we think about shaping our stories to land on the innermost central tension of the story, the punch of the story, whatever that effect is that we're going for? Can we shape a story to point with momentum toward that center? So right off the bat, you'll notice that this is a revisionary craft talk. This is not a first draft that we're talking about here. This is something that after you've written the story and you've thought about it and you've rewritten it and you've really figured out what is really at the heart of your story. What is the innermost central tension? Is it between two people? Is it between a person and their hometown? Is it between a person and their sense of place in history? What is the central tension of your story? Once you figure that out, then you can start to shape your stories to maximize the effect of landing there. So does that make sense so far? So for the purpose of this craft talk, I wanted to look at the opening paragraphs of stories and to see how an opening paragraph of a short story might be doing this work in the revision process. When the author really knows what is the centermost heart of the story, how can they shape their opening paragraphs to prepare and to lead the reader to that effect? You know, my old teacher, Clark Blaze, the Canadian short story writer, says stories are their beginnings amplified. And so I'd like to think about that question too as we look at these opening paragraphs. So the first example I wanted to look at was a short story by Grace Paley called A Conversation with My Father. And this is just the opening paragraph. But I want us to think about the punchlines on the sentence level and at the paragraph level, and how they are amplifying the effects and where they're leading the reader. So my father is 86 years old and in bed. His heart, that bloody motor, is equally old and will not do certain jobs anymore. It still floods his head with brainy light, but it won't let his legs carry the weight of his body around the house. Despite my metaphors, this muscle failure is not due to his old heart, he says, but to a potassium shortage. Sitting on one pillow, leaning on three, he offers last-minute advice and makes a request. I really want to read the next paragraph. I don't know if that's true for you too, but that paragraph is forcing the reader into a direction that we get carried to. We want to go along with it. Not only because of that landing on the request, and now here we go, we're handing off to the request, but the language is so clear and confident. And that confidence comes from Grace Paley knowing what the heart of her story is and shaping this paragraph to aim at it, directly at it. So even though we haven't read this story, maybe this is the first time you've seen the first paragraph of this story, you know, we don't know what the request will be and why it might be a difficult one for the narrator to accept. But if you have read the story before, you probably, now looking back on this, the request is the father wants her to write an old-fashioned story that begins with characters and then just tells what happens next. He's tired of her jumping around in time and telling complicated stories. He wants a straight old-fashioned story. How is that implied already, even if we don't know that? Something about despite my metaphors. Despite my metaphors, this muscle failure is not due to his old heart, but to a potassium shortage. So here is the central conflict of the story, subtly placed right in the very beginning, the seed of the entire story. A writer with, you know, magical thinking about how language can work versus an old-fashioned, there's reality to deal with. It's a potassium shortage, right? That is the entire central tension of the story right there in the first paragraph. So we'll look at a couple more examples, and like I said, I want to keep this brief, but if you've read A Temporary Matter by Jhumpa Lahiri, A Temporary Matter, the notice informed them that it was a temporary matter. For 5 days, their electricity would be cut off for 1 hour, beginning at 8 p.m. A line had gone down in the last snowstorm, and the repairmen were going to take advantage of the milder evenings to set it right. The work would affect only the houses on the quiet tree-lined street, within walking distance of a row of brick-faced stores and a trolley stop, where Shoba and Shukumar had lived for 3 years. So first-time readers do not know that Shoba and Shukumar are a young married couple who've suffered a stillborn child and who have been grieving separately and incommunicably. They've become experts, as the story says later, at avoiding each other in this small house. They will later use this darkness, this 1 hour of darkness every night for the next 5 nights, to share long-held secrets with each other as a kind of last attempt to repair their own marriage. We don't know any of that yet when we read the story for the first time. And yet, look at the choices in this opening paragraph that blossom into that story. The notice informed them. So right off the bat, this is a story about information and being informed. Who gets informed and by whom is central to the story right off the top. And the temporary nature of the accident. We'll talk about that again at the very end of the punchline of this paragraph. A line had gone down in the last snowstorm, and the repairmen were going to take advantage of the milder evenings to set it right. So you can imagine the sentence saying something like, a line had gone down in the last snowstorm and the repairmen needed to fix it. But there's a difference between they needed to fix it and they were going to take advantage of the milder evenings to set it right. That is landing directly at the central tension of the story. These two people we haven't even met yet in this paragraph are going to take advantage of this brief opportunity of darkness to reveal themselves to each other. They're going to take advantage of these milder evenings to set things right too. The work would only affect the house on the quiet tree-lined street. And then finally we get to where Shoba and Shukumar had lived for 3 years. So almost like a zooming in, focusing. Now we're with the two people who are at the heart of this story. But it doesn't say where Shoba and Shukumar, for 3 years, had lived. It ends with the time, the duration of their relationship. I think signifying that this is a story about the duration of their relationship, the temporary, potentially quality of their relationship. Their marriage might be ending. So just another really fantastic, subtle, beautifully designed paragraph to start a story. I have a couple more for the sake of time. Can we just look at one more and then I'll pass it off to Michael. And I hope this is the beginning of a conversation and not the whole thing, but Alice Munro, Home Furnishings. I'll talk about a first sentence. Elfrida, period. Okay, so there's no doubt what this story is centered on, but it's going to get more complicated. Elfrida. My father called her Freddie. The two of them were first cousins and lived on adjoining farms, and then for a while in the same house. One day they were out in the fields of stubble playing with my father's dog, whose name was Mac. That day the sun shone, but did not melt the ice in the furrows. They stomped on the ice and enjoyed its crackle underfoot. So before we go on, just that image of the kids in memory, right? This is my father and his cousin. Something about that danger, that excitement of on the crackled ice. They enjoyed its crackle underfoot. The ice is starting to crack, but it's enjoyable. There's danger, but it's exciting. What else might be underneath the surface? This story might be asking. What else is going to be crackling underfoot? Of course, now we switch into the present tense. How could she remember a thing like that? My father said. She made it up, he said. I did not, she said. You did so. I did not. Okay, so a brief window into this fight about the memory. They're remembering this moment differently. All of a sudden, and then we're back. All of a sudden, they heard bells pealing, whistles blowing, the town bell and the church bells were ringing. The factory whistles were blowing in the town 3 miles away. The world had burst its seams for joy, and Mac tore out to the road because he was sure a parade was coming. It was the end of the First World War. So again, a punch at the end of this section. This is a story of not only about Elfrida's role in the family, but how we remember our family differently from other people in our family. All right here. And this is I think a 35, 40 page story, a really long story, but the entire story is right here in some ways, right, in these opening paragraphs. We can look again at a bunch of different examples too. This Bernard Malamud story is a different tone, a much longer opening paragraph with tons of details to kind of dress this character Fiddleman up in all of these pretentious, designs as he's traveling in Europe, and then landing on this ironic, imagine all that history, which asks us to think about his role, his relationship with history, and how he might be confronted by a history that he's not able to romanticize as much as he has in this paragraph. But this is what I'm starting to think about, is how do I get my first paragraphs to be the acorn that an entire oak tree can sprout from? I want that relationship in my very first paragraphs, and I'm really curious to hear if you have questions after Michael's done too. If you have ideas about how you do that in your own work, or if you want to press on some of my ideas too. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. And I want y'all to know that when I bought this cardigan, before I bought it, I texted a picture of it to Chris, so he knew. So he should not be surprised that I'm wearing it on the day that we are doing this presentation together. It's really, it's cool to see that we have a lot of similarities in what we're talking about. I find that like what you're also talking about is like, just generally how to keep the reader invested and excited. Like when the first one you were talking about, like you said, you just wanted to jump to the next paragraph, and this is starting to sound more like a conversation, but I'm talking to y'all too. But that's kind of the way I thought about going about like how to talk about the first lines of a poem, or what I was considering like the first moment of a poem. And what I initially thought of, what came to mind was, and I thought of a old professor, a mentor of mine too, Chris Abani had one time in a workshop said that in a poem you can be mysterious, but you can't be frustrating or annoying. And I mean, maybe that sounds obvious, but to put that into context, someone probably me, brought in a workshop piece that was vague. And so he was basically arguing for specificity, because what happened was, because it was vague, the reader wasn't able to continue and was asking questions like, well, what does this mean? Or like, I'm not sure why they use this word. And it basically took them out of the world of the poem. And so he was saying that, it's okay to be mysterious, but like specificity will help, pull your reader along. That mystery might help pull us along and want to, continue reading on, as Chris had mentioned. So I have some examples of like, where it seems that like the poem, took the wrong step. The couple examples I have are like my really old poems, and then I have a few like really like great poems that are not mine, but that like show kind of how the first moments can work really well and get you invested. And in particular, because it's poetry, and I think because we're working with such a small amount of space and sometimes a lot less words, I think the title also really matters too. But before I jump into those examples, what I want to share is as a sort of way to think about how the poet or how the writer is responsible for a poem like being able to work and being like mysterious, as an example, and not going into that realm of frustration. I have this anecdote that I've been waiting to steal from my wife, Alyssa, who's also a writer. Maybe she's here, maybe she's not. I don't know if she's here. If she's not, that's even better. But she had this anecdote that she told me about years ago, and I love it. So we both have this friend who works for the theater department at this university, and he works as a lighting designer. And he once told her that his job as a lighting designer is to go unnoticed. And I found that really fascinating, because it's very true. When you sit down, you watch a play, you're not supposed to notice that, the color of the background changes, or that, when someone's giving a monologue, that you just focused on them. You're not supposed to, you will never notice that the spotlight is on them unless the spotlight misses its cue. So I kind of like to think of the writer in that way, that, and I'm talking about the writer, not the speaker. I think the reader will know the speaker, but the reader should never know the writer, which is to say, your reader should never question, like, what did they mean by that? Like going back to that Chris Abani example, they should never wonder about how the writer was constructing the poem. They should always be invested in the poem and not, you know, like in a play, get up out of their seat because they're so upset or they see what's going on, right? So, and also, you know, relating to Chris's talk, this is kind of like background and mechanical stuff, and this isn't so much about the first draft, even though I'm talking about first moments. So this is like way in the revision process of your poem when you're thinking about like how can I have the reader continue to be interested in, like, really fully invested in wanting to know what's happening in the poem, right? So let's see, did I? No. Okay, so I'm gonna share my screen and show a couple examples of my own work, and these are all dated from, I think, 2009. So here's the first one, and this is only like the first moment of the poem, and this poem was called Dance. Let the pen dance across the page while the soundtrack of my life plays. So the way that I understand this, so there's the title Dance, and then I, as a reader, am expecting for that sort of to be elaborated. And when I get to let the pen dance, that's sort of, and the way I see it, it could be cliche, but it could also just be like sentimental, and I'm not sure why my speaker is thinking this. And then I just kind of take the liberty of adding another line to right across the page, but that was more obvious and apparent. So I feel like already I'm sort of starting to maybe bore the reader, but the most standout two lines are right here, while the soundtrack of my life plays. So that to me is like the first moment of the poem, but as a reader, I don't really know, you know, what the soundtrack, if it's good or bad, and I'm already, you know, like 5 lines in. So that to me is where, you know, the title and the poem aren't really doing anything for each other, and you already have. So I think your reader is willing to a certain extent, and then they can grow impatient. So that is kind of one way where I would point out, you know, wanting to know specific things about the speaker and why are they letting the pen dance across the page. I don't know what is triggering this or what is motivating this, right? My second example of my bad poems is this one, and the funny thing is I get on my undergrad students. If any of you are here, well, you know maybe who I'm talking about. I get on them for like not titling their poems, and then I was like, as if I never did that, and then I found a poem titled Poetry Workshop May 9th, 2009. Like I did that. So I am just trying to like let y'all know like how important a title can be and what you can make it do for the poem. Because I actually kind of like the beginning moment of this right here. I did not arrive like a flaming meteor into this world. Was not plucked on purpose like words in a poem. Again, I'm talking about like writing itself, but I kind of like those like couple, like there's specificity in there, but again, it's not really working or doing anything with the title. And so even beginning right there, the reader might say, well, what does that have to do with the poetry workshop title? Either I was lazy, or I thought I was being clever, or I just didn't know what to title it. But that was a thing I could have revised later on, is like, okay, what am I actually talking about? Is there something going on that I am I making like a list poem? Is there some way that I can incorporate that into the title so that the reader can kind of get attached to that, right? So those are like ways that it didn't work out and that there needed more revision. As for the like good poems, I have like 4 examples that I'm pretty sure I have enough time to go over because Chris gave me time and I talk fast. So no, not this one. Here we go. So this one's a story by Philip Levine, and I'll read just this first couple moments of the poem. Everyone loves a story. Let's begin with the house. We can fill it with careful rooms and fill the rooms with things: tables, chairs, cupboards, drawers, closed to hide tiny beds where children once slept, or big drawers that yawn open to reveal precisely folded garments, washed half to death, unsoiled, stale, and waiting to be worn out. Um, what I really like about this and appreciate is like that he can take a seemingly sort of like boring or like very matter of fact title of a story, and then he has sort of the audacity to like to like go back to that in the beginning with everyone loves a story, and to me that's very inviting, and also the way he's very conversational, his tone. Let's begin with the house. I kind of like the simplicity of that, and I'm kind of going with it, and I'm not surprised because of the title. And it's an interesting thing because then I start seeing like the specificity to write the images. It's kind of all coming together in a really beautiful way. We can fill it with careful rooms and fill the rooms with things, tables, chairs, cupboards, drawers. And then he has this really wonderful little surprising moment too. Closed to hide tiny beds where children once slept. Like that is very surprising to me when I was starting to get a sense of like, okay, you're telling me about a house, sure. And that is like such an interesting detail that I'm kind of like pulled forward and wanting to know more, right? So again, I'm like in the poem, and I feel like, you know, I'm getting to know the speaker a little bit by the way he sort of by his sentence, this like variation of sentence length, these two really short sentences that are very welcoming and inviting, right? And then he has this long sort of winding sentence that sort of brings us like putting the poem all together. And so so that's one example. This one is another way that the title works with the beginning moment of the poem. This is called Lying Down by Dustin Pearson. Every body that hits the ground in hell will get up should they choose it. There's plenty of death and destruction, but no dead. Um, I like the way that this idea, the phrase of like lying down, sort of is echoed in the fact that every body that hits the ground could get up if they choose it, and you can kind of see that image of a body in hell lying down and gets up if it wants to, and it's dark in the way and it's surprising too because I wouldn't have expected that from lying down from that title. You can look this poem up online. It's in, I believe, The Nation, and has a really beautiful twist in the middle of the poem. But again, using sort of the title to sort of how they sort of reverberate the title in the first moments of the poem. And I think just that detail of and also the detail and the specificity of telling us like what happens in hell, I really appreciate, because it's so specific that the speaker knows that the body could get up should it choose it is so fascinating to me that I want to continue on with that, right? This next one, I'm gonna use it as a sort of little exercise or like guessing game for us, and because I love Diane Seuss's work. So this poem is called Song in My Heart. I want to know, maybe in the chat, or you can say out loud what you think either the poem might end up being about, or what it seems like it should be about because of the title, or what like the first line or the first moments might be, revolving around. Joy, something the speaker loves. Melancholy, a memory, desire. Shout out to my students who are like getting those extra credit points. Driving force in Seuss's life. Children, heartbeat. Yeah, all like lovely reflective things, right? Yes, I love it. I have it pulled up on let me share it with my screen again. Hold on. Here we go. And I'll read it because it's a short poem. Let me just find it. Here we go. Song in My Heart by Diane Seuss. If there's pee on the seat, it's my pee. Battery's dead, I killed it. Canary at the bottom of the cage, I bury it. Like God tromping the sky in his undershirt carrying his brass spittoon, raging and sobbing in his hush puppy house slippers, with the backs broke down. No Mrs. God to make him reasonable as he gets out the straight razor to slice the hair off his face, using the Black Sea as a mirror, when everyone knows the Black Sea is a terrible mirror. Like God is a terrible simile for me, but like God with his mirror, I use it. It's such a wonderful subversion of it, like to subvert our expectations. So wonderfully does that. And Diane Suits, if you know her work, she writes like very raw, gritty, grimy kind of things is the way I would describe her. So to have a poem titled "Song in My Heart," it's so wonderful that the first lines are, "If there's pee on the seat, it's my pee." Like it's basically thinking like whatever you thought this was going to be, like I'm flipping that. And so like that is another way to keep your reader surprised, right? Is another way to keep your reader interested. So yeah, such a wonderful sort of way. And I have one more short little segment. Let me find it again. Here we go. I like in the chat, someone noted that my crappy poems of mine were called bleh poems, like the document was titled that. Thanks for, yeah, you noticed that. I was like, someone's gonna notice. This is the very first moment of Danez Smith's very long poem, Somewhere, that opens up their collection, Don't Call Us Dead. And there's a couple things I want to note, but I'll read this first moment. Summer, somewhere. Somewhere, a sun. Below, boys brown as rye play the dozens and ball, jump in the air and stay there. So if you don't know this poem is about Black boys that were murdered and how they go to a place that's not like a heaven when they pass, but they are reborn in this other place where it's always summer. And so Dinez really kind of like gets you into the idea that we are in another sort of realm that they are creating with the repetition of somewhere twice, like really close together. Somewhere, summer, somewhere, somewhere, a sun, and that S sound too kind of is sort of transporting us to that place. Another thing to notice is that stylistically, which is interesting, is that Dinez uses all like lowercase letters. That's like a more formal sort of thing to notice, but I think that's worth noting. And then also just the way that it's specific and the imagery sort of creates, we get closer and closer into this world that Dinez is writing. Somewhere, a sun, and then we drop down below, brown boys, boys brown as rye, and we see what they're doing, play the dozens and ball, jump. And when we think it's something that like might be, nothing uncommon about that, jump in the air and stay there. And then there's this beautiful moment of them just pause there. And we know that we're entering this world that is not like one that we would regularly see. So in another sense, we are sort of being I've heard this used for like short stories too, or fiction. So I don't know, maybe we can talk about this too, Chris, but like that first paragraph or those first few sentences is also like a contract with the reader. Like you're setting the reader up to know like, this is the world you've entered. So these things where boys jump in the air and stay there, like this like fantasticalness is a way that the poem is going to function, like the world of this poem, things like that can happen. And so I'm thinking of how important those first moments of a poem are, plus the way the advantage you can take with having working the title into that and not just, and really, I guess really taking advantage of a title and playing with the title and seeing what the title can do, how it can maybe help establish voice, how it can provide an expectation that you might subvert, such as in Diane Seuss's case. But yeah, so that is what I have. I don't know if it's conversation, but we can, you all can ask questions for me and Chris.
Yeah, I have a question. So you guys were both talking about beginnings and first moments, and Michael, you were talking about titles, which kind of got me thinking about titles in fiction. And Chris, you were mentioning how like first sentences and paragraphs often contain like the center of the whole story in them. And I feel like the title is really the first thing a reader sees. And a lot of times titles inform or allude to that main punch or center that you were talking about. So I guess my overarching question is, when do you start thinking about a title? Does it come during the drafting process, after, or before? Or like, does it just kind of happen? And also, how careful are you when you decide on one?
Yeah, it's a good question. A title has so much power to frame how we see the work of art. This works, I think, most explicitly in abstract painting. So if you go to a museum and you look at splatters on a canvas, and you have so much freedom to imagine what you're seeing, and you interpret the expression how you will. Then you go to the post next to the painting and you look at it, it's like, Japan 1945. You're like, oh, okay, it like totally changes everything you've seen. So, I think of that power that titles have really, really carefully. I tend to wait until I have a full draft and know what the heart of my story is before I select a title. But sometimes, once in a while, a phrase has a certain kind of magnetic pull on me. So sometimes a title can spark a story. That happened for me writing Desert Boys a couple times, where there was this word Habibi that my mom used to say all the time. It's kind of Armenian, like kind of Middle Eastern word meaning like dear, like beloved. And it was a word I just knew there was a story in that word. And so sometimes, rarely, I'll start with the title, but often I'll need to know exactly what I'm pointing at so that I can do something clever like A Temporary Matter does, the Lahiri story, where by the end of the story, the title has a totally new meaning, a new layer of meaning that we didn't understand the first time we saw the title.
Yeah, usually I'll title a poem, and then as I go through the revisions, I'll realize that the poem is changing, is asking me to go in a different direction with it, and so then the title will probably change. So like I'll have like in my my files, I'll have like the original like title, like name of the folder, and then when you go in the folder, there'll be like all the totally different titles, and it basically depends on how the poem itself changes. So I feel like that I put a lot of pressure on myself if I say, okay, this is going to be the title, I got to stick with it, because then I think it keeps me from going in the direction that the poem actually wants to go. And I am starting to be a lot more comfortable with thinking of poetry as a very much more like spiritual practice. And so like I'm okay with like moving on from that title and going back and like forth and just kind of testing it out. I don't like to put that pressure on myself of like needing to keep that title. Yeah.
All right, quick question for Mike. So we're talking about um, the beginnings of poems, and we're talking about revision a lot. I wanted to know at what point in your revision process, um, or what point in the poem, do you feel like you're working more for the reader, and what point of the poem, in creating it or revising it, do you feel like it's still part of your personal process, your spiritual process? Does that make
Yeah.
sense at all?
Yeah. No, definitely. And I've been thinking about the relationship between reader and speaker so much now. Um, I I am trying to get to a place where I am always thinking of the reader, but in a way that the reader in my mind is like a trustworthy person, so that I can be my most honest, sort of authentic, true to self. And usually it's like I always would tell people it's my friend Danny from back home, that whatever I would say to him, he would know, he would nod to know if it's a true thing, if it's an honest thing. And you know what I mean? But he's also like, he has two kids and a job. So if I'm reading him a poem that's not working, he would let me know. And so like, I don't know, like I think I want to imagine a reader there always, but I feel like it'll happen a little bit after the first draft. Like there's that initial spark that gets me to write the thing when that happens that way. And I will try not to think of anybody. I'll just try to like get the words down. But then, I think it's once that initial first draft is done, then I'll start going with, okay, how can this be clear for a reader, right? And that's also a way of saying, how can I say the truth about something too? Yeah, that's a good question.
I saw a question in the chat that maybe we can both take a crack at, Michael. Imogen asked that setting up a main theme or themes in an opening passage can be really crucial, but is there also a case for misdirection? So it's a really good question. One thing I think a lot about is the idea of narrative justice. It's not to be confused with legal justice or moral justice, but narrative justice. When do you know a story is over? And the example that comes most easily to mind is the story of Achilles. So Achilles is dipped into this this magic that only his heel is left out of it. So he's only perceptible to one pain, the heel. That story is not over until that heel gets hit with an arrow. So when I think of the opening paragraphs, I'm thinking about what am I planting in the beginning that is going to surprise the reader at the end. And it's usually the exact opposite. So here's a person who's totally invulnerable to pain. And then by the end, there's this one spot that's done. So if you look at, let me look at an example. Actually, Michael, you pick this up while I look up an example.
Yeah, I think I'm really interested in misdirection because I've been playing with the idea of like how what can be a poem and what can't be a poem, and can I like mess around with the reader by like going in these different directions and being very uncertain. So I think like the writer has to be certain and in control, but the speaker can be uncertain. And by that I mean, when I start having these misdirections and having these uncertainties, I think I started also asking myself, okay, why is my speaker doing this? And why do they want to misdirect? Are they avoiding something? And so things like that, like there has to be a reason so that your reader is satisfied when they get to the end of the poem or that moment, or else if the misdirection is for no reason, then that's when they get frustrated and annoyed that like that they invested all this just to see that you woke up from a dream. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good way to think about it. And, I would just replace speaker with character in fiction, right? So I try to tell my students, I don't like getting tricked in stories. I don't want a story to trick me. I don't mind. I really like it when characters trick me or try to lie to me. Characters lying to me is really interesting, but I don't want the story to be dishonest. I want a story to put everything up front and then surprise me anyway. And that's a really tricky line to figure out, how your story can be an honest story about a dishonest character potentially. But it's a really fun problem to have in the writing process.
When you said that you would replace speaker with character, you made it seem like we're trying to like have people vote what's better, fiction or poetry. Like, sorry, any questions, any other questions?
I have a question that isn't about beginnings, if that's okay. I didn't have a chance to ask it in the radio interview. Both of you have had books come out, during the pandemic. I mean, I think Chris, the gimmicks came out and then boom, the pandemic came out, and then, Michael in October. So I just wondered if you could speak to, I don't know, like how your dreams or expectations of, the book tour happened, fell apart. And what do you, and, obviously the virtual tour has happened. Do you think that's gonna stay? What are the pros and cons of each? I just want you to talk about that experience of releasing this new work, and then, do you feel like there's not an audience that's hearing it because of the pandemic? Yeah.
I it was like a trigger finger. In some ways, um, I mean, it's my first book, so I have nothing to compare to other than like, you know, like other readings I'd done, which is to say, like, I think there was moments where I was like sad that I couldn't go actually see people in Pomona, California, like for whom the book was written. But and I just miss seeing people in general. And so that is part of it. But what was really interesting and cool about the virtual tour was that, I had friends from Minnesota with friends from California with family members in the same like room together, and that was really beautiful. Also, for those of you who know me, I have a 6-month-old, so I did not have to leave the house during the tour and miss seeing my wife and child, and so that's been great. Yeah, and I think I've been like grateful for like the virtual and online and social media community that I have, but I think I'll keep doing things virtual for at least another. I don't know. I think even in the fall, I'll probably be doing virtual things if people invite me. But um, yeah, I think it's made me really. I'm looking forward to seeing people in person when it's safe again, and like, I don't know. I'm just really grateful for the community that I do have and miss it. That's what I'll say. Yeah.
Yeah, same here. I mean, writing a book is a really lonely thing to do, and it takes a long time. And one of the great joys of publishing a book is that it takes you out of the house and it forces you to meet people again and see people and meet new people and do things that you haven't been doing while you've been writing a book. So that was disappointing to not be able to do it as fully as I was able to do my first time around. But it's also a good reminder of the need to not think about stuff that you can't control. You can only control your craft. You have to care about your craft. You have to care about the writing. You cannot control whether it gets published. You cannot control whether it gets good reviews. You cannot control if it becomes a bestseller. And the pandemic made that really explicit and really clear. So in a way, it kind of reframed everything for me in terms of gratitude, how lucky I was. I'm really, really grateful. And so in that way, it's been really, really great, actually, a kind of inversion of how I sometimes feel anxious during the publication process.
Oh, good. Thank you. We have time for more questions.
I have a quick question. So Chris and Michael, at what point in the writing process do you generally find like you come across the heart of the story or the heart of the poem? Like, does it take you a few revisions to get to that point? Or like, could you just talk about like discovering that a little bit?
It takes me forever, Emily. It takes me so many drafts. I usually have a general idea of what happens in a story, but I don't understand why it matters to the character that it happens. And so it takes me draft after draft after draft to figure out exactly what my character is hiding from themselves, usually. And my characters, like real people, are really good. They've built armor their entire lives to block having to face certain things. And the story's job is to put so much pressure on a character so perfectly designed on that particular person to start making some cracks in that armor. And that just takes revision after revision. So for me, I spend about 6 months on a short story, usually. That's on an average. And the last novel took me 4.5 years. So it takes a lot of time for me.
I'm like, come to Poetry Week and write a collection like 2 years. I'm just kidding. It takes a long time for me to find like the heart of something. I think I have like 2 or 3 poems in the collection that came pretty much in the first like 3 drafts. And even then I was like, does this suck actually? And I just don't know that yet. And so I had to put it away for a bit, but it'll usually take me a while to find like the heart of it. And it happens because, and this is the same kind of talking again about the titles, it's because the poem changes and wants to be more than what I initially thought when I titled it, maybe. And yeah, and then there's also like moments, I don't know if any of y'all had like, when you have these breakthroughs, when you like hit the heart of it and it's like almost like it's exciting and almost scary because you're like, man, like man, if I say this, what else can I say? And like you think like that's it, you're like butting up against your own like boundaries, and it's so that's but you can and you will write through that and beyond that and like more nuanced than that. And so like I don't know, I love that feeling. So I'm totally okay with having to really work for the heart of something. I think my like my natural everyday brain gets in the way of like finding what it really should be about, and that's why it takes a long time.
I have a question. I feel like it's very interesting that we've been talking about beginnings, because I feel like for me in this narrative project I'm working on, the ending seems clear and the middle seems clear, and the beginning is like so muddy. I know I want to talk about like why it's happening, how it's happening, and what it meant to the character, but like where to start and how to order the information is just a jumble. And I wonder if either of you could talk about, I don't know if you want to talk about the CNF, you're right, Michael, but like to just, if you can speak to that in any way in terms of your experience.
Michael, I don't know if you want to start with the CNF part of it. I know Glenda, it's good to see you working on that book. So if you want to start with that, Michael.
Yeah, I'd like to hear from both of you too. I didn't, but I would be curious about what Michael and Chris have to say. Yeah.
Well, so the CNFs, like the essays that I'm working on right now, it's usually, and like only it's hard to it's hard to say, because I feel like it's like what I started with, or my beginnings are like anecdotes that as the essay moves on, the anecdote in the beginning grows stronger, or like adds, or like you can see it echoing from something, like as the essay moves on, like it echoes back to that beginning. So there has to be a strong anecdote or a strong image. And I think I would say the same things for a poem, where you know the like the working on right now, it's like I'm talking about this like VHS tape of this fight between these guys, and then later on, and like how me or the speaker, the essay is like watching this and like or imagining it, and I think it becomes more nuanced because I talk about these other things later on, but it keeps kind of echoing that, and so like it's sort of foundational in that way. That's kind of how I see it, is that like at the beginning can have more like tentacles and go out. It'd be easier, I think, or better if I like could read the thing though and be like, oh, like, yeah.
Glenda, I'm thinking about the relationship that the writer has to the events is implied by the choice of beginning, I think. So if you choose to begin the memoir in scene, in a very vivid moment, that feels so direct to this. The writer is still directly involved in that experience, in a way that if the memoir is about shame instead, for example, there might be a long expository beginning, a lot of talking, contextualizing. So depending on the relationship you have to the material that you're remembering, you're going to choose which mode like evokes that feeling to the reader, I think.
Hi, I had a question to follow up on the drafts. I listened to a webinar with Denty Moore, and he said that once he's done revising, he trashes his drafts. And I was absolutely horrified, because I keep all my drafts. And so I'm just kind of curious, what do you guys do with your drafts?
I keep all my drafts, but I don't remember what podcast or what interview I was hearing someone else talking about, like, even if you don't write something down, like the important things will come back and it will stay with you and they'll just keep coming back. But yeah, I don't know. I keep my drafts because sometimes I'm like, oh no, I should have kept this thing from back before. And so I keep them. I don't know. I think it would be just silly of me to just trash them all. Yeah.
I'm gonna horrify you, Lisa. I'm sorry. I write over all of my drafts, so I don't have any of my old drafts. I just keep massaging and destroying, and yeah, I can't imagine the thousands of pages that are burning somewhere, metaphorically.
Okay, well, that's a good place to end. It's 4 o'clock. We do need to end. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you, Chris and Michael. It's great to hear. I mean, now I know what it's like. It must be like being in one of your classes. I wish I could attend. Anyway, hope to see you all. Well, for sure, Chris and Michael, tonight at 7:30, but hope to see the rest of you at 7:30 as well. Bring a friend. Bye-bye.